It is simple-minded. In a game where every single one of its aspects was designed to serve a specific purpose in its narrative, where every hole with something green leaking out of it serves as a metaphor for a specific idea, and where something as simple as how often you heal or how much you bump into someone not only influences the course of the story, but also counts as a reflection upon the people involved in it. It is simple-minded to think that its use of the camera is an exception to the rule, that the constant game of hide-and-seek between the camera and what it captures exists merely to annoy you and put you off in an obnoxious attempt to seem deep, radical, and unsettling. It is simple-minded to think that unlike every other element that makes up the whole of Silent Hill 2, its peculiar camera that sometimes follows behind James, sometimes runs away from James, sometimes stares at him as he wanders off, and sometimes seems entirely disinterested in him, says nothing about James and how you relate to him, about Silent Hill and your place within it. James is the person whose trials in Silent Hill are observed and influenced by you, but you are not James. Accordingly, Silent Hill, which is a town that presents itself differently to different people, does not consider you an exception either. Whoever enters Silent Hill enters a Silent Hill of their own making, one that others may not see, and quite distinct from that of the others. But this rule does not only apply to Angela, Eddie, or James, and although you do witness what generally happens to James and how his Silent Hill looks like, you, quite literally, do not necessarily see what James does, and quite often might see much more than James is willing to see or acknowledge. Silent Hill always makes a distinction between how it is seen by different people, and such a distinction is also made between you and James Sunderland, by giving you a point of view that is entirely different from his. In this sense, whether it's James being observed from the corner of a room while he himself gets to look at things entirely outside your field of view, or him moving and looking in a direction that is the exact opposite of yours, basically coming face to face with you while each of you see something entirely different, every such moment of conflict between James's point of view and that of yours serves to not only put a rather literal distance between you and James, but also to emphasize the fundamental characteristic of Silent Hill as a place that reflects and adapts to the subjectivity of each of its visitors, providing an entirely unique and subjective experience to each of them. And so by giving you a point of view entirely distinct from that of James, the original Silent Hill 2 both grants you a place of your own within Silent Hill, and also establishes a specific relationship between you and James Sunderland, instead of forcibly pushing you to identify with him. But a camera that very much has its own personality can, and in the case of Silent Hill 2 does, serve purposes much beyond simply providing a means of immersing oneself in Silent Hill without having to go through the hurdle of identifying with a self-destructive murderer. Since the distinct personality of this camera is an emergent result of its peculiar interests, of what it finds worth looking at in different occasions, this personalized interest, when contrasted with James's hypothetical point of view, also serves to emphasize his personality, through emphasizing what points of interest he chooses to not see or acknowledge. In a way, through looking at James's Silent Hill from a point of view that is distinct from his, we not only get to recognize what specific things he willingly chooses to ignore, what glaring signs and clues he sees but pretends to not have seen, but we also observe yet another instance of James desperately trying to dismiss and deny the existence of something specific in a world that is nothing but a reflection of himself. All of that is achieved thanks to a camera that focuses on things that, although point to an undeniable part of James, are also constantly neglected by him, as if he's attempting to prove to himself that they don't exist simply through not reacting to or showing any interest in them. But the importance of the camera does not stop there, as all these seemingly abstract arguments for its significance can also serve as incredibly powerful tools for analysis, which, upon being applied to specific occasions and events within the game, can lead us to very novel interpretations regarding the workings of Silent Hill or James's predicament. Interpretations that, making them, without the specific way in which the original Silent Hill 2 uses the camera in those specific occasions, would be simply not possible. One such an occasion, which happens to be perhaps the most iconic within the entire game, would be James's first encounter with the most iconic symbol of the entire franchise. Although for James, this specific encounter, when taking into account the principle of distinct perspectives, perhaps never even happened, as we clearly see him denying the elephant in the room the minuscule of attention that even the tiniest boxes of ammo or bottles of medicine get to enjoy. On the contrary, the elephant in this case not only occupies a great chunk of the screen, but happens to be even larger than James himself, his head entirely enclosed in an overbearing pyramid, and his body covered in all kinds of fluids that just seeing them could mean there is an immediate threat to your survival. Nonetheless, even though the camera is wholeheartedly committed to this not so vaguely threatening elephant, and even though the only things obstructing his way are a row of metal bars that nonetheless fail to hide him, James Sunderland does not even flinch at him, as if Pyramid Head does not even exist. This point is further accentuated by the rather genius placing of a simple door. It is when walking down a tight corridor and moving towards that door that Pyramid Head slowly comes into view, and he specifically comes into view when the next step in the progression of the game is to enter that specific door. While Pyramid Head gets to occupy the other end of the corridor, making sure it is impossible for him to be missed, pun intended, the door that we are headed to is just a few steps before him and on a wall to the right. And although this same arrangement exists in Bloober Team's rendition, what is absent is the fact that, while in the original game the camera is locked onto Pyramid Head, the placing of the door forces James to turn 90 degrees and look away from him in order to enter the next room. And it is at this moment that two of the most subtle decisions in the entire game paint for us one of its most terrifying pictures. Pyramid Head, in the absence of the pale radiance of James's flashlight, is now covered in a terrifyingly red glow, while James simply looks away, not even bothering to turn his head and acknowledge the presence of the monster that stands just a few steps away from him. Even though this simple turning of the head is something we have seen him actively do even for much smaller items of interest. Nonetheless, the player is alone in this horror, if not its only witness, as what happens in the next room proves to us without any doubt that James has plainly decided to not see what was in plain sight. A decision that, after seeing his own corpse lying defiled and lifeless on a couch, he exclaims to the world with the words, "Who could have?" Words that at the same time mean, I saw no one standing behind the bars just outside this room.
My God, who could have?
This is not a mere suppression of emotions, desires, or fantasies, as Pyramid Head is neither an emotion nor a desire or a fantasy. In fact, the idea that he is an agent of authority and executioner that delivers sentences for crimes could be considered obvious. As such, when we see James deny his existence, we don't see him suppress any specific emotions. Rather, we see him foreclose the entire moral system that would hold him accountable for his murder. Following our previous analysis, one could conclude that James is perhaps not suppressing anything, and in fact, throughout the entire game, he actually experiences everything that he is supposed to experience. We see him feel fear, confusion, desperation, and pain. We see him get constantly hurt, and we see him suffer. But what is actually being pushed away is not any of these emotions or experiences. Rather, it is the true cause of them. The pain that James feels is natural. He has committed murder and he has murdered his most beloved. But that is exactly why he is suffering, not because of this or that monster. James's predicament then is perhaps not a resurfacing of this or that suppressed and unconscious emotion, but rather a foreclosure of the reason behind all the emotions he consciously experiences. Accordingly, the fundamental role of the monsters he sees in Silent Hill is not to merely represent something he has decided to push away to his unconscious mind, but rather to provide him an alternative excuse for what he is consciously experiencing, an alternative way for him to justify and explain his suffering without having to acknowledge its true cause, that is, his responsibility. And he doesn't merely suppress this responsibility, if such a thing is even possible, but rather he acts as if there was no such a thing in the first place. He doesn't deny having killed Mary, come up with excuses for it, or blame her for what he did to her. Rather, he acts as if he never did anything, and Mary's murder simply never happened. Likewise, he doesn't act like he isn't hurt or scared. He doesn't pretend to not even see any of the monsters, but rather it is only Pyramid Head who gets a treatment reminiscent of the way he treats Mary's murder. In fact, in the original game, we even see this treatment almost extend to Mary's very existence, as hinted by James's gestures and manner of speech in the graveyard scene with Angela, where he tries and seemingly fails to explain his reason for going to Silent Hill, while holding his head as if he is having a hard time remembering the things he said mere minutes ago. Nonetheless, one now could begin to see Silent Hill not merely as a mirror of one's unconscious mind, but rather as a trial where one is held accountable. And within this trial, Pyramid Head, being both the law and above the law, does not take such a treatment kindly. In this light, the second encounter with Pyramid Head could be seen as his response to James's attempt at foreclosure, with Pyramid Head quite literally intruding into James's world and imposing himself upon James, just as he's seen imposing himself upon the monsters, which evidently are nothing but James's own creation for the purpose of foreclosing his own guilt. While the monsters are mere makeshift justifications that exist to replace the true cause of James's suffering, Pyramid Head is the very embodiment of what he is trying to substitute. But this reintroduction of Pyramid Head not only explains to us the apparent hostility that he seems to have towards James's scapegoats, but also provides us with the best piece of evidence we could possibly ask for regarding a conscious use of the camera in the original game, which was also the first and only time we ever get to experience Silent Hill exactly like how James does. That is, through a first-person point of view. The very fact that Pyramid Head was introduced twice could be seen as a clue that each time it was introduced to two different audiences. Just as with how in the second time he is introduced through James's perspective, and consequently the reactions that were emphasized were those of James, so was his first introduction entirely exclusive to the player's perspective, with absolutely no one in the game reacting to it aside from the player. One could even say that the second introduction was not even much about Pyramid Head, as it was about James's stance towards him and experience of him, and it was precisely for that purpose that a first-person camera was briefly used, to establish an empathetic connection with James and to demonstrate his panic when forcibly and violently faced with what he had foreclosed in flesh, his responsibility, his guilt, what holds him accountable, and what stands for a symbolic system of moral authority and accountability. In another sense, one could argue that if the first-person camera was used when the player was to empathize with James, then perhaps the camera that, in contrast, observes James from a distance was made precisely for that purpose, to observe James from a distance, that is, to study and judge him through an objectifying gaze, rather than empathizing with and looking into his subjective experience, as to make us aware of the fundamental conflict that both plagues and constitutes his subjective standpoint. Such an effect would not be possible to achieve through an over-the-shoulder camera either, since looking at what James looks at while standing on the same ground as him is fundamentally different than quite literally looking down upon him and observing him from a distance, so that you may not be deceived by his self-deceptive perceptions, so that, in spite of all the illusions, you may reach an impartial verdict. The point, of course, is not to argue that one is inherently better or worse than the other, but that it is in fact impossible to do so, since the fact of the matter is simply that altering the way we look at the world and its people fundamentally changes our relationship towards them. From a juror in the original game to perhaps a defense attorney in the remake, it is our way of looking at the defendant that determines our role in the court of Silent Hill. And so, far from being merely a tool for creating dramatic moments or enhancing a form of gameplay, the camera gives you a place. In any and all experiences, it is how you look at things that defines where you stand, and Silent Hill 2, be it that of Team Silent or Bloober Team's rendition, is no exception.